January 25, 1987, Pasadena, California, Super Bowl 21. Lawrence Taylor tears through the Denver Broncos as if they aren't even there. The Giants win 39-20, and Taylor is crowned the NFL Most Valuable Player. He is cemented as the most feared defensive force the game has ever seen. Or at least, he nearly is. Fast forward to May 6, 2010. Inside a room at the Holiday Inn in Ramapo, New York, a 51-year-old broke Lawrence Taylor hands over $300 in cash. Outside, the police are waiting. To truly grasp the gravity of this moment, you have to understand who Lawrence Taylor is. He isn't just a good player who lost his way. By near universal consensus, he is the greatest defensive player in NFL history. Over 13 seasons as a linebacker for the New York Giants, he amassed 2 Super Bowl rings, 3 Defensive Player of the Year awards, and 10 Pro Bowl selections. His 1986 MVP award remains an extreme rarity for a defensive player, unmatched before or since. Inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1999, Taylor didn't just play the game, he permanently revolutionized it. Every edge rusher and pass-rushing linebacker you see today exists because of the blueprint Taylor created with his body between 1981 and 1993. Yet this titan of the gridiron was the same man paying $300 at a cheap motel. On the surface, this reads like a tragic cliché you've heard 1,000 times: cocaine crime and a legend who self-destructed. It looks like the classic fall from grace that confirms our quiet suspicions about athletes who get too much too fast. However, after digging through suspension files, court documents, and the NFL's drug testing records from the 1980s, a darker truth emerges, one the headlines never touched. This isn't simply a story about a man who couldn't control himself. It is a story about a system that watched a man fall dangerously ill, yet kept pushing him back onto the field anyway. To the league, a sick but performing Lawrence Taylor was far more valuable than a healed one. The NFL knew about his addiction for years before anyone outside those walls did. That is the quiet, uncomfortable truth nobody wants to say out loud. They all knew. Williamsburg, Virginia, 1959. Here is the first thing you must understand. Lawrence Taylor did not grow up in a pipeline of despair. He wasn't forged in the poverty of Pahokee Youngstown or East St. Louis cities that feed desperate young men directly into the NFL machine. His upbringing was stable. His father, Clarence, worked every day at the Naval Weapons Station in Yorktown, while his mother, Iris, held a government job. The lights stayed on. The pantry was stocked. The family was whole. This detail is crucial, because when Taylor's story eventually unravels, and it does, the easiest explanation will be to blame it on poverty. People will say he was just a kid who came from nothing, suddenly had everything, and couldn't handle the whiplash. But that explanation is a lie. Lawrence Taylor's deepest wound wasn't born of deprivation. It was born of what football gave him: a feeling of absolute dominance that nothing else in his life could ever replicate. He didn't even play the sport seriously until his sophomore year at Lafayette High School. Before that, he was entirely unremarkable. He wasn't a prodigy or a standout. He was just an average kid gliding through life with average grades and an average future completely unnoticed. Then he stepped onto a football field. For the first time in his life, people were afraid of him. Not just impressed or intimidated, genuinely afraid. It was in the way offensive linemen twice his size shrank before him. It was in the way opposing coaches stiffened in their chairs the first time they watched his game film. Soon, his name began to ripple through local papers, then regional coverage, and finally national scouting reports. Before football, he was a nobody. After football, he was a terrifying force of nature. The transformation was instant, total, and absolute. Yet, Amid the flood of recruitment letters, no one, not his coaches, not his family, not the scouts, paused to ask a question so simple it seems almost impossible to miss. Who is Lawrence Taylor when he steps off the field? Nobody asked because nobody needed to. The football version of Taylor was so mesmerizing that the man beneath the pads became irrelevant. You don't ask what a thunderstorm is doing when the sky is clear. You just wait for it to strike again. In the 1960s and 70s, Williamsburg still bore the heavy, lingering weight of segregation. The legal battles had been won, but the social lines remained rigidly drawn. For a young black man looking for a way out, the paths were incredibly narrow, went the military. Learn a trade, hope your grades were good enough for college, or rely on sports if your body cooperated and the right scout happened to be watching. Taylor's body didn't just cooperate, it conquered. Football was the door, and his sheer physicality was the key. By his senior year, major college programs were clamoring for him. He chose the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. There he evolved into something the sport didn't even have a vocabulary for yet. He was a linebacker doing things linebackers simply weren't built to do, rendering entire offensive game plans obsolete just by stepping onto the grass. In 1981, the New York Giants drafted him second overall. Scouts called it the easiest evaluation of their careers. But what they failed to evaluate, because no one ever thinks to look, was what would happen when the game eventually ended. What becomes of a man whose entire existence is constructed on a football field once that field is stripped away? Was there an actual Lawrence Taylor beneath the armor of a linebacker? Had anyone ever taken the time to find out? He signed his contract. He put on the number 56 jersey. The only version of Lawrence Taylor the world ever wanted stepped onto a professional gridiron for the first time. Nobody had ever bothered to build a second one. In his 1981 rookie season, Lawrence Taylor did the unthinkable. He made seasoned veterans look sluggish. He earned All-Pro honors. Won Defensive Rookie of the Year, and most importantly, kept opposing coaches awake at midnight, staring at game film and asking a question they had never faced before. How do we stop this? The answer was terrifyingly simple. You couldn't. Not with one man, and rarely with two. To truly grasp Taylor's impact, look at the left tackle position. Before Taylor, protecting the quarterback's blindside was just another job necessary, but uncelebrated and moderately paid. After Taylor arrived, the left tackle became the highest paid and most critical position on the offensive line. Every team suddenly realized that without a premier athlete to neutralize number 56, their quarterback wouldn't survive the first quarter. Lawrence Taylor single-handedly rewired the architecture of professional football. By the time he was 24 in 1983, he was already a three-time All-Pro. Then there is the money, a complex web that most fans never examine. At his peak in the mid-1980s, Taylor earned roughly $1.5 to $2 million a year, accumulating an estimated $13 to $15 million over a 13-season career. In Williamsburg, Virginia, that sounded like an incomprehensible fortune. But context is everything. His contemporary 49ers quarterback Joe Montana made nearly $4 million a year simply standing in the pocket, while the man who forced teams to spend millions protecting that pocket earned a fraction of the cost. Fast forward to today, Myles Garrett, playing the very edge-rushing role Taylor invented, signed a 2023 contract with $100 million in guaranteed money. Taylor had zero guarantees. Under the NFL rules of his era, his contract was a fiction. Every cent could vanish overnight if the Giants decided to cut him. Nobody sat him down to explain the brutal reality of agent fees, federal taxes, or the barrage of jock taxes levied by 8 different states every season. Nobody warned him that the average NFL career lasts only 3 years. The illusion of wealth was simply too profitable for the system to shatter, so Taylor spent his money as if the fiction were fact. Critics lazily call this irresponsibility, but true irresponsibility requires ignoring information, and nobody was providing Taylor with any. When NBA legend Scottie Pippen was fleeced by his financial advisor, it was called a system failure. For Taylor, the exact same circumstances earned a harsher label. By the early 1980s, he was the face of New York football, swallowed by the city's fast-paced celebrity economy. But what that lifestyle did to him neurologically was profound. Around 1983 or 1984, while the sacks piled up and the accolades poured in, cocaine entered the picture. Taylor has never hidden this timeline, once admitting, "I loved cocaine. I loved it more than I loved football at times." That's hard to say, but it's the truth. Read that carefully. It isn't a confession of weakness. It's a clinical description of hijacked reward pathways. Football gave Taylor a feeling of absolute invincible dominance. Cocaine simply replicated it. He wasn't choosing drugs over the game. He was chasing the exact same high through two different doors. What the highlight reels, MVP ballots, and Sports Illustrated covers deliberately ignored came to light in 1985 when the NFL suspended Taylor for 30 days for substance abuse. He went to rehab, passed his tests, and returned. The following year, he delivered the greatest defensive season in NFL history: 20.5 sacks, a Super Bowl ring, and the MVP award. Yet Taylor later confessed to playing games so high he couldn't remember the plays, relying purely on instinct. More damningly, he admitted he knew exactly when the league's drug tests were coming. Someone inside the NFL or the Giants organization was tipping him off, giving him just enough time to flush his system. This means the 1986 MVP season. The greatest defensive masterclass ever recorded was built on a foundation the league knew was compromised. They chose to protect the asset rather than correct the problem. Like so many players before and after him, the machine extracted every ounce of value it could, ignoring the rot beneath the surface. In 1988 came a second suspension, a second stint in rehab, and a second return. This cycle wasn't a character flaw. It was the inevitable result of an untreated disease managed by a league that preferred a functioning addict over a cured human being. Taylor pushed his body for 5 more seasons. Then, in 1993, the physical toll became unbearable, and the drug tests grew harder to navigate. The career that had defined his identity, provided his income, and answered the question of who he was finally over. The institutions that profited immensely from his dominance had built him no safety net to land on. The paychecks were going to stop. The addiction was not. He was a linebacker. In the NFL, defensive players don't secure lucrative sneaker deals or decades-long insurance endorsements that carry them into retirement. At 33 in football years, he was already a fossil. Yet the expenses remained fiercely real. The extravagant lifestyle built on the momentum of his peak earning years didn't just halt the moment the direct deposit ceased. It careened forward until it hit a brick wall. For Taylor, that wall was the IRS. For years, jock taxes, multi-state income taxes, levied for playing games across 8 or 9 different jurisdictions a season, had been silently accumulating. Improperly managed, they accrued interest and penalties that would baffle the average citizen. Most players of that era lacked the sophisticated tax counsel required to navigate such a labyrinth. Taylor wasn't unique in his financial ignorance. He merely became the most spectacular example of what happens when the bill finally comes due. The IRS didn't care that he once recorded 20.5 sacks in a single season. In the years immediately following his retirement, Taylor tried to build a second act: business ventures, public appearances. whispers of a comeback that never materialized. The record shows he tried, but 1996 introduced a different kind of record. In Florida, Taylor was arrested for attempting to buy cocaine from an undercover cop. The story dominated every sports page in the country. For the first time, the public saw the ugly truth the NFL had spent years protecting. The addiction that the league's drug testing program was quietly designed not to find was now on full display. The media coverage was merciless. The same ecosystem that once breathlessly reported his MVP feats without ever asking how he consistently passed drug tests while actively using now eagerly branded him a cautionary tale. A fallen hero, wasted talent. Nobody bothered to ask why the system had allowed him to stay sick for so long. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, his financial ruin was complete. Taylor was reduced to something unimaginable in 1986, sitting at folding tables in sterile convention centers, signing helmets and faded photographs for $50 a pop. The man who had fundamentally rewired the architecture of professional football was now peddling his signature in suburban hotel ballrooms. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone in those rooms knew exactly what they were witnessing. In 1982, the NFL proudly unveiled its substance abuse program. It promised regular testing and strict consequences, a PR victory signaling the league took the drug crisis seriously. In reality, it created a mechanism for selective enforcement. Taylor tested positive and was suspended twice in 1985 and 1988. But in the years between, he was using heavily and passing clean. He later admitted carefully that he knew exactly when the tests were coming. During those exact same years, the NFL was marketing his image, raking in television revenue, and selling his number 56 jersey to a generation of fans. The league and the Giants organization had every financial incentive to manage the testing schedule to protect their most lucrative defensive asset. There may not be a signed confession, but the historical record reveals a precise repeated pattern that defies coincidence. They didn't cure him. They managed him. For 13 seasons, Lawrence Taylor allowed his body to be weaponized. His knees absorbed the brutal toll of the trenches. His spine compressed under the weight of endless collisions. And his brain absorbed thousands of subconcussive hits, the kind of invisible trauma the NFL would spend the next 3 decades pretending didn't exist. In exchange, he received contracts completely devoid of meaningful guaranteed money. He made an estimated $13 to $15 million over his career, roughly $1 million a year prior to taxes, agent fees, and the multi-state jock taxes he was never prepared for. This was the compensation for a man who made the left tackle position worth $30 million a year to every franchise in the league. When the ride ended in 1993, there was no healthcare bridge, no financial transition plan, no neurological or psychological counseling to help him decompress from the most violently intense environment on earth. The NFL took 13 years of his life and gave him back a basic pension and a bronze bust in Canton. When Taylor was first suspended in 1985, the clinical understanding of addiction was still primitive. The dopamine depletion model. The scientific consensus that chronic cocaine use physically rewires the brain's reward circuitry, making abstinence agonizingly difficult, was not widely accepted. The rehab he received was purely behavioral, built on the flawed premise that a player just needed enough willpower to quit. When Taylor relapsed, the system concluded he just didn't want it badly enough. They never considered that the treatment was wholly inadequate. This failure repeated itself in 1986, 1987, 1988, and well into the 1990s. The league kept sending him to the same obsolete facilities, expecting a different outcome. It wasn't a recovery program. It was a theatrical ritual performed to maintain the illusion of care. May 6, 2010. Ramapo, New York. Rashid Davis. A 30-year-old pimp had trafficked a 16-year-old runaway from the Bronx. Davis arranged a meeting explicitly, telling his client the girl was 19. The client paid $300. The client was Lawrence Taylor. The police, tipped off to the setup, were waiting. Taylor was arrested and initially slapped with a felony charge of third-degree rape. Within hours, his mugshot was everywhere, not because it was the most severe crime in Rockland County, but because the defendant was Lawrence Taylor. After intense legal maneuvering, Taylor pleaded guilty in 2011 to misdemeanor sexual misconduct and patronizing a prostitute. He received 6 years of probation. But crucially, he was placed on the sex offender registry for life. Meanwhile, Rashid Davis, the architect of the crime, who manipulated a child and deceived his client, was convicted of sex trafficking, served 6 years, and walked away with a finite registration period. Taylor will be on that list until he dies. This glaring disparity isn't a clerical error. It's a damning indictment of a justice system eager to exploit a famous name. The actual trafficker got a lighter effective sentence than the man duped into the room. The true rock bottom wasn't the arrest itself. It wasn't the humiliating registry paperwork he would have to file every year for the rest of his life. Rock bottom was the crushing realization that the world would now forever hold two opposing truths about him, and one would always drown out the other. The greatest defensive player in NFL history. A registered sex offender. Both are true, and both will remain true long after he is gone. No legal settlement, no public apology, and no passage of time will ever alter the brutal arithmetic of how those two facts sit side by side in the public consciousness. Taylor didn't just lose his money. Wealth can be rebuilt. He lost the right to be remembered as a complete human being, a man who made monumental mistakes, paid his dues, and grew. That door slammed shut in 2011, less because of his actions, and more because his name was exactly the headline the system wanted to sell, and the sport he sacrificed his mind and body for. They had no comment. So, what is the true dark reality of Lawrence Taylor's story? It isn't that he loved cocaine more than his career. He admitted as much, and while he was telling the truth, it wasn't the moral failing you think it is. It isn't that he committed a heinous sex crime. The documented record reveals a man who was deceived about the situation he walked into, prosecuted with a severity vastly disproportionate to his actual role, and permanently branded in a way the actual child trafficker was not. And it certainly isn't that Lawrence Taylor is just another cautionary tale, that neat, comfortable narrative we tell ourselves about a man who made bad choices, suffered the consequences, and learned a lesson we can conveniently file away. Here is the uncompromising truth. Lawrence Taylor did not fail because he lacked discipline. He did not fail because he was weak. He did not fail because he was handed too much, too fast, and couldn't handle the weight of it. He failed because a multi-billion-dollar system watched him fall ill in 1983 and calculated that managing his sickness was vastly more profitable than curing it. He failed because the contracts he signed were an illusion, and no one in any official capacity ever bothered to explain the brutal math. He failed because the behavioral rehab he received in 1985 and 1988 was fundamentally unequipped to treat his neurological disease, and the system footing the bill had zero incentive to close that gap. And he failed because when the ride finally ended, and he was a broke 51-year-old man with an untreated addiction, the criminal justice system decided his famous name was far more valuable as a sensational headline than as a nuanced truth. The machine built Lawrence Taylor, the linebacker. It never built Lawrence Taylor, the man. And when the linebacker was finally retired, there was nothing left underneath. 20.5 sacks. 1986. NFL Most Valuable Player. For nearly 4 decades, that number has been immortalized in the record books as the absolute pinnacle of individual defensive achievement, the greatest season a defender has ever played. But here is what that number actually represents. It is the exact price the NFL paid to look the other way. Every single one of those 20.5 sacks was executed by a man the league knew was deeply sick. Every one was recorded during a season where the drug testing apparatus was quietly, gently manipulated to ensure the results came back clean. Every one generated massive television ratings, ticket sales, and jersey purchases that flooded the league's coffers, while its medical and disciplinary wings did absolutely nothing that might risk interrupting the broadcast. 20.5 sacks wasn't the peak of Lawrence Taylor's greatness. It was the evidence of the league's complicity. America has a deeply parasitic relationship with the athletes of this era. We extract everything they have to offer: their knees, their spines, the fragile tissue inside their skulls, and we neatly package it as entertainment. We construct towering mythologies around their physical dominance, then sell those myths back to them as the sole measure of their human worth. And when the performance inevitably ends, when the mythology has nowhere left to go, and the broken man standing beneath it has no tools to survive the transition, we have the audacity to call it a personal failure. We demanded that Lawrence Taylor be a weapon for 13 years. We watched him be simultaneously brilliant and broken, cheering the brilliance while actively ignoring the brokenness. And when the brokenness was all that remained, we wrote self-righteous columns about his poor choices. This story matters, not as a warning about drugs, not as a moral referendum on celebrity and excess. It matters as a historical document of what this sport does to the men it consumes and how expertly it vanishes when the bill finally comes due. Lawrence Taylor is 67 years old. He lives in Florida. He still makes the rounds at memorabilia shows. He still signs his name. He is still introduced as one of the greatest to ever step onto a gridiron, and without question, he is exactly that. The applause in those hotel ballrooms is genuine. The reverence is real. Yet he still fills out a sex offender registration form every single year. His name remains chained to that database, and it will remain there long after the applause fades. It will be there after everything else stops. His body bears the heavy invisible toll of 13 NFL seasons. The ruined knees, the aching back, the trauma that doesn't show up on an X-ray but echoes through every room he walks into. The question that nobody bothered to ask in 1981. Who is Lawrence Taylor when he is not on a football field has finally been answered. By time, by circumstance, by an unforgiving system that engineered one version of him with meticulous care and left the rest entirely to chance. He knows who he is now. The profound tragedy is that he had to spend 30 years and lose absolutely everything he had just to find out. Nobody built him that answer, because nobody ever thought to.